Grandpa, you're no one here. That's how my visit began. Not with a handshake, not with a smile, but with those 5 words, cold enough to frost over the air between us. I had come expecting warmth, maybe even pride, thinking my presence would mean something. Instead, it felt like I had stepped into a stranger's territory, not my grandson's workplace. The words weren't shouted. They were almost whispered, low enough that no one else would catch them, yet sharp enough to slice through the thin layer of dignity I carried with me. I stood there for a moment, not because I didn't know how to answer, but because I was trying to understand how a boy who once ran to me after school, who once called me his hero, could now look at me as if I were just another face in the crowd. I glanced around the lobby. The place was buzzing, employees moving briskly, visitors in suits, polished shoes clicking on marble floors. The air smelled of fresh coffee and expensive perfume, but under it all, there was the scent of something else. Status. I realized, standing there in my worn jacket, that this was his world now, and he was telling me I didn't belong in it. I wanted to say something. To remind him of the summers we spent fixing the old fishing pier, of the nights I stayed up with him when he was sick, of the hands that had built the home he grew up in. But the words sat heavy in my chest, refusing to leave. Sometimes silence is more dangerous than shouting, because it leaves the other person alone with what they've just said. He didn't wait for me to respond. He turned, checking his phone, straightening his tie as if the conversation was over before it began. I stood there, an invisible man in a place where my bloodline should have been enough to make me seen. But deep down, under the sting of the moment, there was something else. A quiet knowing. Life has a way of arranging its own reckonings, and though I didn't yet see how, I had a feeling that before this day was over, the weight of his words would come back to him, not from me, but from someone he didn't expect. Friends, let me pause here for just a moment. Please write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever had something like this happen in your life? And if you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe and share this video. It's the best way to help us grow this channel. Now, let's continue. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just looked at him, letting the silence settle between us like a heavy curtain no one dared to draw back. In that stillness, I searched his face, the sharp jawline that had once been soft with baby fat, the eyes that used to light up when I walked into a room, the posture of a man who believed he had climbed entirely on his own. I remembered the weight of him as a child, perched on my shoulders, his small hands gripping my hair for balance as we walked through summer fairs, through dusty roads after fishing trips, through life itself. Back then, he thought I could carry him anywhere, and in a way I did. Now he stood before me in an expensive suit, polished shoes planted firmly on a floor I knew too well, because I had helped build it. Not this building, perhaps, but the ground beneath it, the sacrifices, the hours, the quiet decisions no one saw. It struck me how easily time can turn gratitude into amnesia, how quickly history can be rewritten when the people who lived it are pushed to the margins. He kept his gaze somewhere over my shoulder, scanning the room as if there were more important things to see. But I kept mine fixed on him, not in anger, in something far heavier. Disappointment has a way of softening the edges of rage, turning it into a quiet grief. I didn't need to remind him of the storms I had weathered so his life could be sheltered. I didn't need to list the nights I went without so he could have more. Those memories weren't gone. They were just buried under layers of ambition and the desperate need to be accepted by people who didn't know our story. The longer I looked at him, the more I realized that this wasn't just about one moment. It was about a slow erosion. Every unreturned call, every visit postponed, every time he let the distance grow without noticing. Today was only the day the last bridge caught fire. And I understood something then. Sometimes you don't need to fight to win back dignity. You just need to wait. Because life, in its own way, has a habit of bringing the truth to the surface. And so I said nothing. I let the silence do what words could not. The lobby was alive with movement, but not for me. People streamed past in tailored suits and crisp dresses, voices rising and falling in quick bursts of business-smooth conversation. Laughter flickered here and there, not the warm, unguarded kind you hear at a family table, but the polished sort that belongs to people who measure their words for profit. Briefcases clicked shut, coffee cups steamed in manicured hands, and I stood in the middle of it all as if I had been placed behind glass. No one's eyes touched mine. It was as if I'd stepped into a world where I didn't exist, not in their memories, not in their awareness. Their gazes slid past me like rain over stone, landing instead on the next handshake, the next opportunity, the next someone who mattered. I was just another shadow in their periphery, a man without a name in a room full of names printed on business cards. I watched them move, and for a moment it felt like being back at the edge of a wedding I once attended, uninvited in spirit, though my name had been on the list. That same feeling of being tolerated rather than welcomed wrapped around me again, a cold, familiar coat. In a room this full, loneliness becomes louder. Every laugh you're not part of echoes like an empty hallway. Every sidelong glance that misses you entirely becomes a small confirmation that you are not part of this picture. I shifted my weight, feeling the ache in my knees, a reminder of years spent working on my feet, building things that lasted longer than most of these conversations would. I had once believed that the work a man does earns him a place, that the bridges you build, literal or otherwise, become your invitation into the rooms of the future. But looking around, I saw how fragile that belief was. These people didn't know whose sweat had built the community hall they hosted their charity events in. They didn't know whose calloused hands had repaired the pier they took their families to in summer. They didn't know because no one had told them. And my grandson, the one person here who carried the truth of my life in his veins, was too busy proving himself to those who didn't care to hear it. So I stood there, a relic no one thought to dust off, an unspoken chapter in a story they all thought they already knew. But I didn't leave. Not yet. Because somewhere in this crowd the day's balance was already shifting, unseen, quiet, and inevitable. In the midst of all that noise and movement, my mind slipped away from the marble floors and polished glass walls to a simpler time, a day that smelled of cut grass and sun-warmed wood. He was small then, no more than 8, his hair always messy, no matter how many times his mother tried to tame it. His eyes were wide and bright, not from screens or ambition, but from the thrill of being outside with me, helping with what he believed was important work. We were fixing the old fence along the back pasture, the one that had leaned for years after a winter storm. I remember the way he grinned when I handed him the small tin of nails, his little fingers curling around it like it was treasure. He kept looking at me for approval every time he passed me another one, as if each nail was his contribution to something that would stand forever. Every so often I'd catch him watching me hammer, his head tilted, studying how I held the wood steady, how I didn't rush the work. He liked that I let him hold the hammer once in a while, though it was heavy for him, and the nail always went in crooked. I never straightened them right away. I let them stay for a moment so he could see the proof that his hands had been part of building something. Back then, he called me Grandpa, with a warmth that wrapped itself around my heart every single time. He didn't see me as old or outdated, just as the person who could fix things, who could make things better, who would always show up. We'd end those days sitting on the porch with lemonade, his hair damp from running through the sprinkler, his voice carrying in the twilight as he told me about some dream he had. And I'd listen like every word was sacred. Now, standing in that lobby, surrounded by people who didn't know my name, I realized how far we had drifted from those days. The boy who once looked at me as if I could do anything now looked through me, past me, around me, as though I were nothing more than an interruption. The change hadn't happened all at once. It had been slow, like wood weathering in the rain. And maybe I hadn't noticed because I still saw him through the lens of those better days. But as much as it hurt, I held on to that memory, because it was proof that there had been a time when I mattered to him, and proof that somewhere, deep under the layers of pride and ambition, he still knew exactly who I was. Life has a way of peeling back those layers when you least expect it. And though he couldn't see it now, the day would come when he would remember. For a brief moment, I considered turning around and walking straight back out into the cold. The thought of slipping away without another word was tempting, to let the glass doors close behind me, and take with me what little dignity the morning had left untouched. It would have been easy. No one in that lobby would have stopped me. In fact, most of them wouldn't have even noticed. My absence would have been as quiet as my presence had been invisible. And maybe, in that moment, that was the safest choice, to retreat before the weight of humiliation grew too heavy to bear. But I didn't move. Something held me there, something far stronger than pride and far older than stubbornness. It wasn't about proving myself to anyone in that room, not even to my grandson. It was the quiet knowledge, born from a lifetime of watching the way the world turns, that truth doesn't need an audience to exist. It doesn't need to be shouted from a stage or written in bold letters across the sky. Truth waits. It waits for the right moment, for the right eyes, for the right crack in the noise where it can slip through unnoticed, until it is suddenly undeniable. I thought about all the years I had spent working in silence, building things no one ever celebrated because they were too busy enjoying them to wonder who made them possible. The bridge that carried trucks safely over the river didn't have my name on it. The community hall that echoed with wedding vows and charity fundraisers didn't hang my picture on the wall. The work spoke for itself long after my hands were gone from it. And in that same way, I believed the truth about who I was and what I had done would surface here too, without me forcing it. So I stayed. I stayed even though every second in that room felt like sandpaper against my skin. I stayed as laughter from across the lobby broke into pieces I could never hold. I stayed as my grandson kept glancing past me, his attention tethered to conversations that seemed, in his mind, far more important than the man standing in front of him. I stayed because leaving would have been easy, but staying meant giving fate a chance to do what it does best, to place the right people in your path at exactly the right time. I didn't know then who that person would be, or how they would see me when everyone else refused to look, but I felt it, as surely as I had ever felt a storm rolling in before the clouds arrived. Something was coming, and all I had to do was wait. From the far side of the lobby I noticed him, a man whose presence bent the room around him without effort. He wore a deep charcoal suit that seemed cut from the kind of fabric you don't find on any store rack, his stride measured, unhurried, as though time itself moved to accommodate him. He didn't scan the space like the others did, searching for opportunity. He moved as if he already knew where he was going, and as he did, the air shifted. Conversations thinned, laughter faltered mid-sentence, people adjusted their postures, straightened their jackets, smoothed their expressions. Respect, or at least the kind of attention money demands, seemed to ripple outward in his wake. My grandson noticed too. The moment their eyes met across the room, I saw the shift in him, the squared shoulders, the subtle tug of his tie, the way he anchored his feet just so, as though planting himself in a position that said, "I belong here." There was eagerness in his face, that quick flicker of anticipation you see in someone who believes their moment has arrived. I could almost hear the thoughts forming behind his eyes. He's coming over to speak to me. This is my chance. I stood still, making no move to insert myself into what was clearly, in my grandson's mind, an approach meant solely for him. But I watched. I watched the deliberate pace of the man in the suit as he crossed the polished floor, watched the way he seemed to notice more than he let on. His gaze brushed over the others in the lobby, acknowledging them without slowing, until it landed squarely on us. Or perhaps, I would soon learn, not on us, but on someone specific. With every step he took closer, I felt my grandson's energy grow, a performance beginning before the curtain had even risen. He adjusted his stance again, chin slightly lifted, the faintest smile forming, as though preparing to greet an opportunity he believed he had earned through his own rise. He didn't look at me now. I was part of the scenery, the background in a scene where he imagined himself the only player of importance. Yet there was something in the man's expression, a quiet recognition, like the faint outline of a memory rising to the surface. I didn't know him, at least I didn't think I did, but there was a certain familiarity in the way his eyes lingered a fraction longer on me than on anyone else he'd passed. It was fleeting, but I caught it, and something deep inside me told me that this meeting was not going to unfold the way my grandson expected. So I stayed still. Let them both walk their separate lines toward the same point. One of them, certain of the script, the other, me, waiting to see just how the ending would be rewritten. When he finally reached us, the man's gaze didn't land where my grandson expected. It moved first to him, yes, a brief, polite acknowledgement, but then it shifted almost immediately to me. Not the cursory glance you give a stranger, not the unfocused sweep of a busy man's eyes, but a pause, a study, as though he were turning the pages of some half-forgotten memory, scanning for the sentence that would bring it all into focus. For a moment, I felt the weight of his scrutiny, not in a way that made me shrink, but in a way that rooted me more firmly where I stood. His eyes carried a question, and behind that question was the faint hum of recognition, like a melody you can't quite place, but are certain you've heard before. I saw the faint lift of his brow, the narrowing just slightly, the almost imperceptible softening in the lines around his mouth. Something in me, something long accustomed to being overlooked, knew that he was remembering, even if the shape of it hadn't yet taken full form in his mind. My grandson didn't see it. Or if he did, he dismissed it as nothing. He was too busy holding his smile in place, ready to extend his hand the moment the man addressed him. I could feel the anticipation radiating from him, a quiet tension as he waited for the moment he believed was his. But in the space of that waiting, the man in the suit kept his gaze on me longer than was necessary, longer than manners alone required. And then, almost like a flicker of light across water, there it was, the shift. His eyes lit in a way that told me the search was over, the memory found. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was certain, the kind of recognition that can't be faked. I didn't know what he remembered yet, or from where, but I knew it was real, because his posture changed. The slight tilt of his head, the deeper breath he drew, the way his steps slowed in those final inches toward us, all of it told me that the man who had entered this lobby with the authority of his position was now also carrying something else. Respect. It happened so subtly that most of the people in the room wouldn't have noticed. But I did. Because after so many years of living in the quiet spaces of other people's lives, you learn to spot the exact moment when someone stops seeing you as a shadow and starts seeing you as a man they should have remembered all along. It started at the corner of his mouth, the way a sunrise begins before you even see the light. A slow, deliberate curve, not the reflexive, practiced smile of a man in business, but one born from a recognition that went deeper than the moment. His eyes stayed locked on mine, and in them was something I hadn't seen in a long time, the unspoken acknowledgement of worth, the kind that doesn't need to be explained with words because it carries its own weight. It was the smile of someone who knows exactly who you are, and more importantly, what you've done. I felt it land in my chest like a quiet vindication, not loud enough for the room to notice, but strong enough to steady my breath. There was no rush in it. He wasn't hurrying to greet me, wasn't tossing out a polite expression on his way to something more important. This was different. This was intentional. The kind of smile that belongs to a man who has connected a face to a story he hasn't forgotten. My grandson, standing just inches from me, was oblivious. His focus was still on what he assumed would happen next. A handshake for him, a brief word, perhaps an introduction to others watching. He couldn't see that the center of gravity had already shifted, that the moment he thought was his was quietly sliding toward someone else. And so, I stood there, not moving, letting the silence between us stretch. I didn't return the smile right away. I wanted to be sure it was real, that it wasn't a trick of my own hope. But the longer he held it, the more I knew. This wasn't about politeness. This was about history. Shared or witnessed, I didn't know yet. But it was there, etched into the way his eyes softened and the way his chin dipped slightly, as if to say, I remember. It's a rare thing, being truly seen after you've been treated as invisible for so long. And in that moment, the noise of the lobby, the hum of voices, even my grandson's restless shifting faded to the background. All I could hear was the quiet truth in that expression, and the unspoken promise that whatever came next, it would not be what my grandson had imagined. He stopped directly in front of me. Not a sidestep toward my grandson, not even a glance to acknowledge him first. Just a clean, deliberate halt in my space, as if there had never been any question about where he was headed. His presence felt different up close, not just because of the authority he carried, but because of the way he looked at me, steady, unhurried, with the quiet certainty of a man who knows exactly why he's standing where he is. Then his hand came forward, not the loose, distracted offering of someone shaking hands out of habit, but a firm, grounded gesture, the kind reserved for equals. His palm was warm, his grip strong, not a test of strength, but a confirmation. Respect, in physical form. And then the words that landed heavier than the handshake itself. It's an honor. I had to remind myself to breathe. I wasn't expecting it. Not here, not now, not in front of my grandson who had only moments ago told me I was no one. But there it was. An open declaration, a reversal of the verdict I had been handed at the door. And it came not from me defending myself, but from someone else. Someone whose voice carried weight in this place. The room didn't go silent, but it felt like it had. My senses sharpened. The light reflecting off the marble floor, the faint hum of an espresso machine somewhere behind the reception desk, the sound of my own heartbeat pushing against my ears. My grandson shifted beside me, the anticipation on his face now bending into something else. Confusion, maybe, or disbelief. He hadn't prepared for this version of the scene. I didn't rush to answer. I didn't deflect the compliment, didn't wave it away as though it meant nothing. Too often in life we're taught to shrink when someone offers us honor, to make ourselves small so others feel more comfortable. But I'd spent enough years being small. So I met his grip with my own, matched his steadiness, and let the weight of his words stand unchallenged. It's an honor, he had said. And whether my grandson liked it or not, that truth now hung in the air between us, undeniable. In that moment, I knew the tide had shifted. And though my grandson might still be pretending not to understand, I could feel the lesson beginning to write itself into him, line by line, without either of us saying a word. It happened so subtly that if you weren't paying attention, you might have missed it. The way the air seemed to thin, the hum of conversation softening as though someone had reached for the volume and turned it down a few notches. One by one, heads began to turn. Not all at once, not in a dramatic sweep, but in that slow, deliberate way people look when they realize something is happening that might be worth remembering. The boss's words had landed like a stone dropped into still water. Quiet at first, but the ripples were already spreading. Those nearest to us had heard him clearly, and their eyes darted between the two of us, trying to place this unexpected connection. The unspoken question moved through the room. Who is he? Not me asking about them, but them asking about me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my grandson's expression shift. His mouth parted slightly, as if he were about to speak, but no words came. The look in his eyes was caught between two worlds, the one where I was just an old man standing awkwardly in a place I didn't belong, and the one that was rapidly forming before him where I was suddenly someone. Confusion fought with realization, each taking turns in the briefest flickers of his gaze. It was the kind of silence that isn't really silence at all, the quiet that hums with awareness where everyone is pretending to be occupied but is really listening. Even the receptionist's hands paused over the keyboard. Somewhere, a coffee order sat ready, untouched, because its owner was watching instead. I didn't move. I didn't offer an explanation or step into the moment to make it easier for anyone. I'd learned long ago that when the truth finally decides to arrive, you don't rush it. You let it fill the space, seep into the corners, and settle where it needs to. My grandson's jaw tightened. Not in anger yet, but in discomfort. He was used to owning the spotlight in this place, used to being the one who drew people in. Now the light had shifted, not because I had demanded it, but because someone else, someone whose opinion mattered here, had chosen to turn it on me. And the room, as if on cue, was holding its breath to see what would happen next. "I've heard about your work," he said, his voice carrying that calm certainty of someone speaking the plain truth, not trying to flatter. "The old bridge? The community hall?" His eyes didn't leave mine. "I grew up there. You don't forget the hands that built what matters." It was said so simply, so casually, that for a moment I wondered if he realized the weight of his own words. But the way they landed, not just on me, but on the people within earshot, told me he knew exactly what he was doing. The lobby seemed to lean closer. The bridge he mentioned flashed through my mind. Long summer days hauling lumber, hammering beams under the relentless sun, the smell of river water mixing with sawdust. I could see the grain of the wood, the curve of the railings, the way the light hit the water beneath when it was finally finished. And the community hall. I remembered winter evenings there, not attending events, but repairing the roof after storms, sanding floors until they gleamed again, wiring the old lights so that they'd hold for just one more wedding, one more fundraiser, one more season of life for the people who depended on that space. Those places were never just structures to me. They were proof that something you build with your own hands can become part of other people's lives in ways you'll never fully know. Hearing him speak of them now, not as landmarks but as parts of his own childhood, struck me harder than I expected. Somewhere along the years, my work had stopped being mine alone. It had woven itself into the stories of people I had never met. And here stood one of them, a man whose success had brought him to this place, carrying pieces of my labor in his own past like quiet foundations he didn't even have to think about to feel. My grandson was silent beside me. I didn't need to look at him to feel the heat rising off him, the stiffness in his stance. He had grown up hearing about those same places, but to him, they were just stories, things his grandfather did once, long ago, things that belonged to another time. He'd never thought of them as anything that mattered to anyone in his world, until now. The boss's words had changed the air. They weren't praise for a job well done. They were recognition of something lasting, something that couldn't be erased with the passing of years or the turning of attitudes. And as I stood there, listening to a stranger speak of my life as though it had shaped his, I realized this was the kind of justice that doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It arrives quietly, slipping in between the moments, and suddenly, without warning, the truth is out in the open, impossible to push back into the shadows. It happened in the smallest of ways at first, a glance here, a quiet turning of a head there, but it was enough for me to feel it. The air, heavy with indifference only moments ago, began to move differently around me. Eyes that had slid past me without a flicker now met mine, and held, some with curiosity, others with the kind of respect that can't be faked. A few heads gave almost imperceptible nods, the silent language of acknowledgement in a room where words were currency and gestures meant more than they seemed. It was a strange thing to feel yourself come into focus for people who had previously looked straight through you. Not because I had changed, but because someone with authority had said, "This man matters." And now, as if they had always known, they adjusted themselves to that truth. I saw my grandson's posture change in the periphery. It was subtle, but to me, it was as clear as if someone had dimmed the lights on him. His shoulders, once pulled high with the unshakable certainty of being the most important person in the scene, lowered just a fraction. The proud set of his chin wavered, the stiffness in his jaw softening. It wasn't defeat exactly. It was something more complicated, pride cracking just enough to let in the smallest draft of reality. He didn't look at me right away. He kept his eyes forward, as though still trying to hold his ground in a conversation that had already shifted beyond his control. But I could sense the quiet war going on inside him, the confusion of seeing the man he had dismissed as no one being treated as someone worth knowing. The people around us didn't crowd in, didn't rush to shake my hand or ask for stories. But there was a difference now, a space that hadn't been there before. It was in the way they positioned themselves, the way they gave me a little more room, as if that space had been earned. It was in the way their eyes no longer skimmed over me, but landed and stayed, even if just for a heartbeat longer. And I understood then that moments like this don't erase years of being overlooked. They don't undo the sting of being made to feel invisible by the very people you once would have done anything for. But they do something else. They plant a seed, not in me, I'd long since made peace with who I was, but in them, and especially in him. Because once you've seen the truth about someone, you can't unsee it, no matter how hard you try to go back to the story you told yourself before. His hand didn't drop away quickly, the way most handshakes do in busy places where people are already looking over your shoulder for the next introduction. It stayed, steady, certain, as if he was anchoring the moment so it couldn't be brushed aside or forgotten. His grip wasn't about formality. It carried a weight I could feel in my bones, a wordless recognition that travels deeper than courtesy ever could. Then he spoke again, his voice low but carrying enough strength to reach the edges of the lobby. "We stand on the work you did. Some debts aren't measured in money." Those words settled over me like the closing of a chapter I didn't even know had been left open. It wasn't the kind of praise that comes wrapped in flattery, meant to impress an audience. It was the truth, unpolished and unshakable, spoken without hesitation. And the beauty of truth like that is that it doesn't need to be argued. It just exists. I felt the years roll back in an instant, not to erase them, but to lay them out like stepping stones. The mornings before sunrise when I left the house while the world still slept. The winters when my hands ached so badly I could barely close them. The countless hours I spent in the shadows of projects that others would one day take the credit for. All of it was here now, standing in this man's voice, given its rightful place. Around us, the quiet shifted again. It wasn't the stunned stillness from before, but something softer, almost reverent. People who had been halfway through greetings or sipping their coffee now seemed to hold back, as though aware they were witnessing something that didn't happen often in a place like this. Respect, real respect, had its own gravity, and it pulled everything else to a halt. I didn't respond with a speech. I didn't tell him about the nights I worked by lantern light, or the sacrifices that never made it into any ledger. I just met his gaze, let the silence carry my answer, and gave the smallest nod, not of agreement, but of acceptance. Because what he had just given me wasn't charity, and it wasn't pity. It was a verdict. A final quiet judgment in my favor, delivered without fanfare, but with all the force it needed. Beside me, my grandson still hadn't found his voice. But I didn't need to hear it to know what was happening inside him. That single sentence from his boss had done more than any argument I could have made. It had shifted the foundation under his feet. And there's no going back once you've felt the ground move. He didn't speak, not a word, not even a whisper, but his eyes had lost the sharp, dismissive edge they'd carried when I first walked in. Now they carried something heavier, something he couldn't hide even if he tried. Shame, yes, but not the loud kind that makes a man rush to defend himself. This was the quiet shame that sits deep in the chest, the kind that doesn't ask for an audience, because it knows it has already been seen. And beneath it, tangled up in ways he wasn't ready to admit, was respect, reluctant perhaps, but real. I met his gaze, not to gloat, not to twist the moment into a weapon, but simply to let him know that I saw him now just as clearly as he was seeing me. The proud posture he'd worn earlier had softened, his shoulders drawn slightly inward, his jaw unclenched. His eyes darted once toward the boss, then back to me, as if trying to reconcile two versions of me that had collided without warning, the one he had convinced himself was no one, and the one standing here now, recognized in front of his peers as someone who mattered. It struck me how moments like this don't just reveal the truth, they leave a mark. I could see the weight of it settling into him, the slow understanding that once a truth has been spoken out loud, it can't be undone. He couldn't take back the words he'd said to me when I arrived. They would live in the space between us for as long as memory allowed. And yet, in that same space now, something else had begun to grow. A small, unsteady bridge built not from apology, but from the look in his eyes. We stood there in that suspended stillness, surrounded by a roomful of people who were pretending to go about their business, but whose attention hadn't really moved elsewhere. I wondered if he realized that this wasn't just my vindication. It was his reckoning, because this wasn't about the boss's handshake or the nods from strangers. It was about the truth finding its way to the surface in front of the one person who had tried to bury it. He lowered his gaze for a heartbeat, just enough for me to know that he felt the full weight of what had happened. And when his eyes rose again, there was no arrogance left, only a mixture of things he would never be able to put fully into words. Regret for the things said, surprise at the man he'd just been reminded I was, and the quiet, humbling knowledge that respect, once lost, is far harder to reclaim than it is to give in the first place. When I finally turned to leave, it wasn't because I'd been dismissed or because there was nothing left to say. It was because the moment had already done what it needed to do. My steps were unhurried, steady, each one carrying me further from the sting of the morning and deeper into something quieter, stronger. I didn't look back to see if he followed. That wasn't the point. This wasn't a scene that needed reconciliation on the spot or the awkward exchange of rushed apologies. Justice had already arrived, and it had done so in the gentlest, most unshakable way possible, without me raising my voice, without me proving a thing, without me demanding to be seen. It had arrived in the way the boss's hand had clasped mine, in the way his voice had carried truth through the room like a bell that couldn't be unrung. It had arrived in the stillness that followed, in the shifting eyes of people who now looked at me differently, in the change in my grandson's gaze, a change he couldn't hide, no matter how hard he might try. Justice had come not in anger, not in revenge, but in that rare, clean moment when the world reminds someone exactly who you are, and leaves them no choice but to accept it. The glass doors opened to the chill outside, and the cold air hit my face like a baptism, washing away the weight I'd carried in with me. I stepped into the street with my head high, not because I'd won anything, but because the truth had stood on its own and been recognized for what it was. I thought about the years behind me, the bridges and buildings and quiet labor that had outlasted praise and outlived the indifference of those who didn't care to notice. That work was still there, holding strong, just like me. Somewhere behind me, in that lobby of polished floors and hushed ambition, my grandson was standing in the aftermath, alone with the echo of his own words. "You're no one here." Maybe those words would haunt him for a while. Maybe they would become the thing he wished most to take back. Or maybe they would be the start of something better, a crack in the wall he'd built between us, a small place where humility could take root. That was his journey to make, not mine. As for me, I walked away with no bitterness in my chest, only a deep, settled calm, because in that moment, in that day, in that room, I had been seen, truly seen, and I knew that whatever else my grandson might tell himself in the years to come, he would never again be able to believe the lie that I was no one.